Hi, welcome to the Israel First television program with myself, Martin Black, and from our studios in Jerusalem. Great to have you with us with a program that looks at news. We have interviews, and in the Jerusalem Post, this is a recent edition of the Jerusalem Post. As we've come into the studio, it says police brace for violence at Temple Mount's Golden Gate, and the Temple Mount is again featured in the Jerusalem Post, and it says Israeli police are bracing for violence after Palestinian officials and activists called for Muslims to head to the Temple Mount compound to protest Israel's intention to close the Golden Gate, site known as, in Arabic, Bab al-Rama. The Golden Gate, also known as the Gate of Mercy, was sealed by Israeli authorities in 2003 because of a group who had links with Hamas, a terrorist group, was using the site for meetings, but I've also seen they were using the site for fundraising, and there was also concerns about construction work on the site. The Israeli government believes the work carried out by the Waqf destroyed archaeological artifacts that prove the Jewish presence on the site thousands of years ago. Now, today in the studio, we are very pleased to have Yisrael Medad. Thank you so much for coming in and giving us your time, and great to have you with us. A veteran journalist. He's American born, and he's also, as well as being a journalist, you're an author, political advisor. You've worked in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, as an advisor of international affairs to a cabinet minister. Since 1970, he's been an activist for Jewish rights on the Temple Mount, and we're going to be talking about the importance of the Temple Mount for the Jewish people. He's been featured in the International Herald Tribune, the Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, Israel National News, and Haaretz. And he's also appeared on the BBC Hard Talk. And that's not such an easy show to be on. That's where they really give you a hard time. As well as being called BBC Hard Talk, they give you a hard time. And you've been on, and you also feature on Israel's ILTV News. So, first of all, let's just for our friends at home that you're watching today and you're saying, well, where is the Temple Mount? Maybe we can just give them a bit of geography. You can explain a little bit where it is located. It's in the old city, of course, of Jerusalem, but maybe we can start off there.
Okay. It's to the east of the center of the city. It's located on a geographical location called Mount Moriah, which is mentioned early on in the Bible. And it sits above the original city of David, where the original capital of the first monarchy of the Jewish Commonwealth existed down a little bit lower in the valley. It's most noted by, most people come to the Western Wall to see the last remnant of the Temple Mount. If you look up, there's a large wall. It goes all the way around a compound, which is about 144 dunams, which is about 60 or so acres, and within used to be where the first and second Jewish temples were, where the Crusaders had a church, and where since about 690 or so, there have been mosques or other Islamic institutions.
Yeah, if we go today and you're coming to visit Jerusalem and you go down to the Western Wall and you see the people praying there, a very typical kind of the tourist scene, and they look at that, and then you see the section above, which is the Temple Mount. They can be quite confused because we've got the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim dome there. So I think that might confuse some of people watching. Think, well, that's a strange thing when this is the Temple Mount.
Well, what happened was very simple. After the Second Temple was destroyed and the Jewish Commonwealth lost total independence and military and economic power, first there was the Romans, and the Romans became the Byzantine period, when Byzantine accepted Christianity, and then there was a short Persian invasion, and then Arabs came out of Arabia at around 638 and swept over most of the Middle East, continuing on to North Africa and beyond. But in the meantime, they came to Jerusalem, and Muhammad, who had been dead already, had left some sort of thinking that we should be praying towards Jerusalem. So today, if you ask a Muslim, they say the first Qibla, the first direction of prayer was to Jerusalem, and then between you and me, he decided that no Jews would join in his new faith of Islam, so they turned everybody around and faced Mecca and Medina to the southeast. But they left a mosque there called Al-Aqsa, and then slowly but surely the entire compound was rebuilt with walls, some of them original walls from the Herodian period, or even the Eastern Wall, for example, is the Hasmonean period, which was what we call the Greek period of 100 to 200 years before the Common Era. And then various buildings were built. Later on in the early 8th century, what you call the Dome of the Rock was built. Schools were built, like other things were built. You mentioned, and my last point on this, you mentioned the Mercy Gate, or the Gate of Bab al-Rahma. That was built at the end of the Byzantine period, and then it was redone by the Muslims, and it was sealed since about 1241. In other words, you can't come from the outside of the Temple Mount.
So if you're looking from the Mount of Olives, there's no way to access the Temple Mount from that side.
That's correct. You can see it. It's a very large ornamental type of a structure with like all sorts of things on it, but you can't go through.
So how did you get involved with the Temple Mount? Because you came here in 1967, is that right?
I was here as a student in 67, but my wife and I immigrated in 1970, actually. I was approached by some people, and the situation was explained to me. And
about the Temple Mount?
About the Temple Mount.
Right.
I knew its importance. There's always a problem of what we call religious restrictions from the Jewish point of view about whether you can or cannot go in. For example, the chief rabbinate has a sign outside, Jews are advised not to go in, through the only gate that non-Muslims can go through. But I studied the situation. I came to the conclusion that this is Jewish property in a spiritual sense, for sure. And we're not going to throw anybody away, but I should be able to go up there, enter freely, even pray up there. If that interferes, then a sign is some sort of corner.
Right. Now, in 1967, that was when that was the Six-Day War.
That's correct.
And that's when the Jewish soldiers came over that area, which is Israel. By the way, we should explain, this is all Israel. This is not, we're not talking about Jewish Israel going into Jordan or going into another country. This is Jerusalem, the center of Israel. And this is Jewish soldiers retaking the old city, retaking the old places, the old synagogues. And one of the places they retook, which is the most famous perhaps, is the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is in our hands. So you were just there at that incredible time.
It happened to be, I was there when I was a student at that time.
Wow.
Of course, it was, I don't know if our audience listening in or watching us knows, but there was a famous song that was sung about a month and a half before the war, even less than that, 3 weeks before the war, called Jerusalem of Gold. Very, very famous song. And I happened to be at a small moshav southwest of the city, in a place near Lachish called Amatzia. And on that Wednesday, we heard over the radio in the afternoon, the Temple Mount is liberated, the Western Wall is in our hands,
wow.
The old city is ours, and everybody got up to sing Jerusalem of Gold. Wow. It was very emotional, very, very uplifting.
And maybe one of the things, Yisrael, you might not know at home is that there was no guarantee you would win this war. This was this was maybe a war of even extinction that now we know with the benefit of history that Israel was able to win, but at the time that it was a fight not knowing what would happen.
Yes, I mean, during those 3 weeks, the public mood was very, very non-optimistic. I'm not going to say pessimistic, it wasn't quite optimistic.
Maybe you can tell us a bit about the Temple Mount itself, because as we were reading in the news story, there's there's issues up there, and we regularly read about it in the news. Maybe you can tell us about the Muslim Waqf. Why on earth is it that Jewish people in all of Israel, the one place where they should be allowed to pray, they can't pray?
Well, first let's define terms. In Islam, you can dedicate property or land or buildings or property, and that's called waqf, W-A-Q-F or K-F. And so there is a Muslim religious trust, and they say once something has been dedicated, you cannot change ownership anymore, and especially people who are non-Muslim. So what happened was, after that Muslim conquest I mentioned many, many years ago, 1600 years or so, they declared the entire Temple Mount as religious property. And they built one mosque up there called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They built the Dome of the Rock, which properly is not a mosque. It's a memorial to the foundation stone that is underneath there. And in certain periods of time, they would allow Jews or other religious people, non-Muslims, up there. But basically from around the 13th century until the 19th century, no non-Muslim was allowed on the Temple Mount. Put that together with the fact I intimated before that there's a problem about religious authorities allowing you to go into sacred portions that are up there, even though the site is much more larger.
And yeah, the site is not a whole mosque. It's not like the mosque covers the whole of the Temple Mount. It's only a tiny building on this big site.
That's one of the most important things that get mixed up with people when they talk about the phrase Al-Aqsa is in danger. They use Al-Aqsa for the entire Temple Mount, when they only used to call it Haram al-Sharif, was the official name for the compound. In fact, if you go online, you can see guidebooks to the Haram al-Sharif from 1924, 25, 26, and it says in it, right, this was the site of Solomon's temple. Wow. Nowadays, if you ask them, the temple was never there. It was someplace else. And so...
which is a bit sad when they have the diggers there for their own mosque purpose, and then people discover in the rubble that's been dug up, there's temple artifacts. So it's a bit inconvenient that that they find these things.
Right. But sometimes they make mistakes, as they did many years ago, and they dumped all this stuff out. Anyway, the last point I wanted to mention was when Israel took over the Mount in 67, Moshe Dayan came along. He sat down with the Waqf officials. And I don't know what he told them exactly, but his thinking was, I don't need a flashpoint of religious excitement, fanaticism, extremism, whatever you want to call it. You will keep the administration of the Temple Mount. We will put guards at one gate, the Mughrabi gate, which is just above the Temple, the Western Wall, and Jews will pray only at the Western Wall down below. It was a great deal. Why not take it? That was called the status quo, and ever since, even today, you can hear our current Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, say, Jews will visit, but Jews will not pray. And that's the political reality that we're faced with. Don't forget, Moshe Dayan grew up during the Mandate, when no Jews were allowed to go on the Temple Mount. Talking about it today, if you talk to a young kid of 18 to 20 to 25, he doesn't know that reality. So, you know, he would say to himself, if he was a defense minister at the time, he'd say, you know what, you could administer the site, you can pray inside your mosque. We will not allow Jews to go in the mosque and pray, but let's find an area outside, and I'm sure you've been up there, and for most of our audience maybe who don't know, it's a very huge, large area. There are many small corners where you can find, and that's basically what set off the controversy of the Mercy Gate, because I think the Arabs presumed that we thought that that hall down the steps leading to the Mercy Gate could be a nice synagogue.
And I think one of the things that that you need to appreciate is that we're not talking about Israel wanting to retake the Temple Mount, wanting to remove the mosques, wanting to remove the Muslims. What we're talking about is a shared access, an equal rights access. In fact, we've had Alan Baker talk about this, the legal rights of the Jewish people to be on the Temple Mount, they should have legal access and legal rights to pray. And but it's interesting that there's more and more people talking now about the Temple Mount. There was the big conference, and we had Doran Kedar in the studio talking about the Temple Mount conference, and there's more and more people wanting to go and access this. By the way, if you come to Jerusalem, there's certain times, it's not open all the time,
No.
and there's only one gate. Don't try and go through the other gates. There's one gate you're allowed, which is near the Western Wall, and there's certain times, so make sure you check the times when you come. Now, tell us a bit about, there was an incident where you were on the Temple Mount. I think you were even chained to something. Tell us about that. That's so interesting. I couldn't really find much out about that.
Well, you have to realize that, as I mentioned earlier, the Temple Mount is called Mount because it was built on Mount Moriah. Mm-hmm. But of course, when you enter it, it's a flat area. So you could say, where's the mountain?
Right.
Well, the mountain is underneath. So there are a lot of subterranean chambers all around the Temple Mount. There are water cisterns, there are tunnels, but on the south, okay, the mountain steeply declines, so that what Herod did was he sort of built up columns and drew the floor out, okay? So where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a drop of maybe 40 meters eventually down below. Mm-hmm. So if you're standing in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you can see steps leading down, okay, and a green door, and that will lead you all the way out to the southern wall. Now, recently, 10 years ago or so, a little over 10 years ago, the Muslims dug out that entire area and created a new third mosque for 5,000 people inside.
And that's kind of underground, is that right?
It's all underground. You really wouldn't know it unless you're there.
And there's kind of air vents. That's the only way.
Air vents and all sorts of things like that. And many years ago, before this digging out happened, we came up with the idea of protesting that we can't pray, and we brought along handcuffs, and we chained ourselves to the railing of those stairs going down. The police were completely taken aback. It took them 20 minutes to find these huge cutting scissors to take us out. There was a bit of a
So did it catch the news, or?
Well, at that time, one day's newspaper was the news, and now, nowadays, news is something else entirely. But I still have a picture of Dennis Lipkin, who ran for Knesset on a joint Jewish-Christian list, holding up the handcuffs, one of his hands in handcuffs. But yes, we've tried to pray up there. We've tried to. Nowadays, it's more of getting more and more Jews up there. Don't turn it into a flashpoint of possible violence. Simply work hard in getting hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews up there daily, weekly, monthly, and get it more that way.
And what we're talking about is the site of the temples. This is such an important place for the Jewish people. You know, we very regularly we talk about the fact that the Jewish people have come back to the land of Israel. And amazing, even where the studio is, was resettling Israel. We talk about Jerusalem coming back into the land, but for me, it's always amazing that this is such an important thing. And the other thing that's strange is that everybody seems content with just the Western Wall, which is just a retaining wall. It's like people going to a synagogue And instead of going inside the shul, they stand outside by a wall.
Well, that of course proves how actually Israel is willing to compromise. No other, I don't think any nation would allow such a situation. That's in fact exactly what happened when the Arabs conquered Jerusalem. They did away with everything and they said, no one can come up here. So what's wrong with us taking Jerusalem and saying, okay, you're off? We didn't say that. We're willing to compromise. But I want to point out something to show you a little bit more of the hypocrisy involved, not of our side, but of the Muslim side. I don't know how many of our guests watching and people who have been to Cordoba in Spain. Cordoba has a cathedral. That cathedral, for many years, was a mosque. Right. It originally was a church, then it was a mosque, and then when the Reconquista came through the Muslims out of Spain, they turned it back into a cathedral, a church. Muslims today go into Cordoba, they lay out prayer rugs, and they begin to pray as Muslims because they want that site back.
Inside the cathedral they do that?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes. And so I say, whether or not they're right or wrong, if you're doing that thousands of miles from the Middle East in Spain, you don't at least understand why I would want to go on the Temple Mount and pray? And one other point, we've been talking about Jews all the time. There are a lot of Christians who know that Jesus was brought to the temple, that Jesus overthrew tables on the Temple Mount. There are prophecies involved whether he's coming back to this area. Christians also have a stake. They should be able to, it's not only prayer. You can't open a Bible, a Christian or a Jewish Bible up there,
right,
and either pray. Sometimes if you're a non-Jewish tour guide with a non-Jewish tour group, you could quote from the Bible. But if friends of mine called the Hayovel group, who work in the vineyards in Judea and Samaria, he kept on talking about the temple. The temple, they shut him up. They said, we're going to throw you out. This is the temple. This is Haram al-Sharif. This is not the temple.
Gosh.
So it can be very fluid at times at the situation, but it doesn't make sense, as you said.
Right. Now, if you're coming to Israel and they're going today, they're going to be okay. There's good security there.
Oh, there's good security. The only problem they'll have is sometimes there's a long wait. When I go there sometimes, the line of tourists goes out the dung gate, all the way down the hill and around outside the walls.
So you heard that. So do arrive early. It's very important. If you really want to be on the Temple Mount, you're going to have to do a bit of effort and arrive before all the other tourists come, and they come out of their hotels, I guess, just after breakfast and go straight
Early breakfast.
And then they go straight to the Temple Mount. Well, thank you so much, Israel, for your wisdom and your experience of the Temple Mount. If they would like more information, there's a lot of information online they can go to about the Temple Mount.
Oh, sure. There's loads of stuff, and in fact, if they even type my name and add the word Temple Mount Flashpoint, they'll get a short monograph of about 20 pages, which I wrote, that overviews the entire situation. But put in Temple Mount, all sorts of stuff like that, they'll get the news.
Thank you so much, Yisrael, for coming in the studio today, giving us your time, coming across from Shiloh. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this.
Wonderful to be with you today. You know, we are going to start a new cycle and speak again about the Hebrew language because it's so exciting and so important for the time where we are at now. Now, if you think, the Bible was written in Hebrew. And so it's very important for us to really, if you want to know more of the Bible, we need to know a bit of the Hebrew and carry on learning, not only for us, but we need to bring it also to the next generation. Very important. Now, the Jewish people learn the language for a long time. They've been always studying. The Torah is written in Hebrew, so for them is normal, but you have to understand that before they were only using it for praying and also for studying. But like suddenly, when it was when they came back in the land here, Eliezer ben Yehuda said, "No, we need to have the language again for day to day," which was a big revolution for them, because some people say, "No, it's the holy language; it's just for praying." And he said, "No, people were speaking Hebrew before, and if we want to be united, we need to have one language." And it's what happened here, and it's amazing because if you think the British mandate recognized the Hebrew as an official language, and it wasn't before. When Eliezer arrived here in 1981 with his family, nobody in Israel was speaking Hebrew as a daily language. His son, Ben Zion, was the first little boy who was speaking Hebrew and only Hebrew. They were making sure that nobody could speak another language next to him, so his ear will be just used to hear the Hebrew language. Amazing. So this Eliezer ben Yehuda had one vision, that this language, the Hebrew language, will be used again as a daily life on the street by everybody, and now this is a reality in Israel here, and now it's for us to learn this amazing language to know more about the Bible. See you next week. Bye.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, looking at the importance for the Jewish people of the Temple Mount and the importance for all peoples of the Temple Mount, and the importance of the Jewish people being able to pray there and Christians being able to pray there. We love to receive your emails. Please email us at info@israelfirst.org. Visit the website, a lot of information on there, www.israelfirst.org. And remember, we're the program that looks at the land, the people, and the language.